Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking something absolutely fascinating. We're decoding the surprisingly logical reasons behind the seemingly quirky money habits of anyone who grew up under the shadow of 1970s scarcity. Look, if you know someone who always, without fail, keeps a hidden $20 bill tucked deep inside their wallet, I promise you, they aren't just being quirky. They remember exactly what it felt like when there simply wasn't enough. So let's dive right in and explore how a single decade permanently rewired an entire generation.
You know, you've probably seen these hyper-specific actions firsthand, right? Turning off every single light the absolute second a room is empty. Or maybe feeling this vague, almost invisible guilt when they spend money on themselves. Or, and this is a classic, pausing even just for a split second before tossing a simple, mundane rubber band into the trash. From the outside looking in, especially to younger generations, these actions, they might look like sheer stubbornness, or honestly just being cheap. But as we're going to uncover today, they are actually deep-seated, incredibly logical survival responses. That tiny hesitation before throwing away a rubber band, that's not a personality quirk. That is an entire economic decade talking to you.
And that brings us to a really fascinating paradox. A lot of the people exhibiting these exact behaviors, they are doing absolutely fine right now. In fact, by almost every objective measure, they might be doing way better than fine. They're often completely financially secure. They have the savings, the house is paid off, yet they still can't fully relax their grip. So to understand why these deeply ingrained habits outlived the actual emergency that created them, we have to look past the surface. We really need to put ourselves in their shoes and focus intensely on the historical and economic environment that literally forged them.
Okay, to truly grasp this, we have to step back into the reality of the 1970s. Because here's what most people fundamentally misunderstand about that era. It wasn't one massive, dramatic, Hollywood-style overnight crash. You couldn't point to a single day on the calendar like Black Tuesday and say, yep, that's when it all fell apart. No. It was a slow, quiet, and honestly, a much more damaging kind of collapse. Imagine being a parent, setting a standard household grocery budget in January, feeling okay about it, only to have inflation run so blindingly hot that by October, that exact same budget is completely useless. The math just stops working. Imagine the visceral, everyday anxiety of seeing gas lines stretching all the way around city blocks, just to get to work. Imagine the profound shock of watching factory towns that had hummed steadily for literally decades suddenly going completely silent. It was this insidious, creeping economic instability that families didn't just analyze through data or the evening news. They felt it. They felt it as a constant, low-grade hum of uncertainty that simply never, ever went away.
Now imagine being a child during all of this. Because if you were a kid in that environment, you obviously didn't understand the complex intricacies of inflation or macroeconomic policy. You didn't care about interest rates. You experienced the economy entirely as an atmosphere. You felt that heavy, unspoken tension sitting at the dinner table whenever the bills were brought out. You heard the subtle, anxious shift in your parents' voices when they talked about money behind closed doors. You knew that highly specific, sinking feeling of wanting a toy or a treat at the store and knowing, literally before the words even left your mouth, that the answer was going to be no. That thick atmosphere of scarcity didn't just pass through these kids like a phase, it settled deeply into their brains. It permanently altered their worldview, hardwiring them to believe that the idea of running out of resources wasn't just some minor inconvenience, it was genuinely existentially scary.
And you can still see the physical manifestation of that fear today. Seriously, go look inside the pantry of someone who grew up in the 1970s. What are you going to find? You will find canned goods stacked 3 deep. You'll find enough dried pasta to comfortably survive a mild apocalypse. You will see 4 giant bottles of dish soap sitting there when one would clearly do the job. Now, if you ask them why they have all this, they'll give you a totally practical answer. They'll say, well, it was on sale, or I just don't want to run out, or simply, hey, you never know. And technically they aren't lying. But the deeper psychological truth here is that the brain that originally learned to fear running out, it never fully stopped preparing for it. This is a crucial distinction. There is a massive difference between having an anxious personality and executing a highly logical survival adaptation. These folks aren't inherently anxious people. They are stocked people. That backup plan for the backup plan, that's a survival strategy that just outlived the crisis.
Which brings us to this absolutely staggering number. 200,000. Somewhere out there right now, there is a 1970s kid driving a car with 200,000 miles on the odometer. The air conditioning? Yeah, it's probably a little weak. One of the back windows definitely doesn't roll down all the way, and the engine makes this highly questionable sound on cold mornings that probably means that belt needs fixing. Yet, it gets them from point A to point B reliably, so they are stubbornly, almost fiercely holding on to it. Their friends are completely baffled by it. Their kids are probably embarrassed to be seen in it. Heck, even their mechanic has mixed feelings about keeping this thing on the road.
But again, we have to look deeper at the why. What looks like pure irrational stubbornness to us is actually a deeply held, almost sacred life philosophy. If something works, replacing it is waste. Think about it. For a generation that literally watched their parents stretch every single dollar until it nearly tore in half, the very concept of waste is abhorrent. Throwing away a couch that just needs to be reupholstered? Immoral. Upgrading a perfectly fine phone that really just needs a new battery? Unthinkable. Retiring a pair of shoes that could easily be resold at the cobbler? Why on earth would you do that? To them, throwing away something that still functionally works isn't just a bad financial choice. It feels like a profound moral failing.
Now, as we shift gears a bit, this brings us to a really fascinating emotional contradiction. It's something that absolutely confuses people who know and love a 1970s kid. It's this stark, almost night and day contrast between how they treat themselves and how they treat others. When it comes to spending on themselves, it always carries this faint, inescapable residue of guilt. If they buy something nice just for them, it feels reckless. It feels like tempting fate, like the universe is actively watching them be indulgent and it's just preparing to slap them with a massive, unexpected bill. But conversely, spending on their loved ones, that feels entirely different. It feels like protection. It feels like actively creating the safety net for their people that they didn't have growing up.
Let's actually quantify what that looks like in daily life. Take the exact same person, faced with spending, say, $15 on a slightly nicer lunch for themselves on a Tuesday. They will agonize over it. They'll talk themselves right out of it, decide it's entirely too indulgent, and ultimately just eat a sandwich from home. But a $200 birthday gift for a grandchild or a spouse, they will quietly drop that money without even blinking an eye. Suddenly, that famously rigid budget has a massive amount of flexibility. So what's the takeaway here? Their generosity is fueled by memory. They are purposefully using the resources they didn't have growing up to buy for others exactly what they learned not to ask for themselves. They're making sure their loved ones never, ever have to feel that cold, sinking atmosphere of scarcity.
So how does this deeply protective mindset react when confronted with sudden, unexpected abundance? You naturally assume a financial windfall, like a surprise bonus, an inheritance, or a tax refund that's way bigger than expected, would feel incredibly good, right? And on a pure logical level, sure, it does. But if you watch this generation receive a windfall, you're going to witness a very specific, almost choreographed sequence. Step 1 is receiving the money, but step 2 is where the psychology kicks in. There is an immediate pause. There's a guardedness. It's almost a deep suspicion, as if this sudden influx of cash comes with invisible terms and conditions they simply haven't read yet. They don't pop champagne, they don't celebrate. And step 3, that money gets routed straight into a high-yield savings account, or it simply sits entirely untouched in a checking account for 6 solid months while they think about it.
Why on earth do they react to good news with suspicion? Well, because it is pure, unfiltered pattern recognition. Their reluctance to splurge isn't irrational in the slightest. It was born from a decade where good economic news had a really nasty habit of never, ever lasting. Back in the 1970s, stability was always provisional. It was just a mirage. They learned by watching their own communities that the families who relaxed, the ones who went out and spent freely during those brief good months, were exactly the ones who ended up scrambling the absolute hardest when things inevitably took a turn for the worse. So they don't let the money sit because they don't want nice things. They let it sit because they learned, in the deepest part of their psyche, to never trust a calm sea.
But look, it is vital we don't just view this whole generation through the lens of anxiety or fear, because doing that completely misses the most empowering part of this story, and that is the unseen competence of scarcity.
When scarcity doesn't break you, it tends to build this incredibly specific, unglamorous, roll-up-your-sleeves kind of competence that abundance rarely ever produces. These are the people who learn to fix a leaky faucet at 12 years old because calling a plumber, that simply wasn't an option. They learn to cook entire meals from scratch because the luxury of convenience foods costs money the family just didn't have. They learn to wait, to negotiate, to make do, and to improvise when the systems around them failed. And those skills, they don't just evaporate when the financial margins finally widen later in life. The kid who learned to stretch a meager dinner becomes the adult who can brilliantly stretch a household budget during a hard year without completely falling apart. They are quietly competent people who just get results without ever needing an audience or, a YouTube tutorial.
And that leads us to the ultimate quiet punchline of this entire explainer: 40. For 40 straight years, while the rest of the culture was constantly upgrading, subscribing, discarding, and replacing everything in their lives, this generation was quietly executing their core philosophy. While everyone else bought a brand new car every 5 years, they just kept driving the one with 200,000 miles. While others chased luxury and status, they saved the difference. And it turns out, if you diligently apply the philosophy of, if it works, don't touch it, for 40 decades, it acts as an unbelievably effective, stealthy wealth-building strategy. What the outside world eagerly labeled as being cheap was actually the exact mechanism that allowed them to build formidable, unshakable financial stability over a lifetime.
So when we finally zoom out and look at all of this together, we see that we are not talking about a generation of hoarders or cheapskates or people who are tragically stuck in the past. We are talking about a generation of elite adapters. Those behaviors we mentioned at the start, the extra $20 hidden in the wallet, the lights obsessively turned off, that single rubber band saved in a kitchen drawer, they are fossils. Think about it. They are perfectly preserved behavioral artifacts from a time when those tiny, minute acts of carefulness genuinely, truly mattered to a family's day-to-day survival. Once you truly understand the origin of these habits, they no longer look strange at all. They look exactly like what they are: the profound money habits of people who paid very, very close attention to a highly instructive decade.
Which leaves us with this final, somewhat provocative thought. As we've seen today, our financial habits are rarely random. They are deeply rational responses to the specific economic environment that raises us. The 1970s clearly gave that generation a tremendous amount to respond to. So looking at our own era right now, our era of rapid inflation, the gig economy hustle, digital subscriptions draining our accounts, what modern economic adaptations are you unknowingly developing right now? What weird financial quirks are we actively passing on today that will absolutely baffle the next generation 40 years from now? Something to think about, right? Thanks for joining me on this deep dive explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll catch you on the next one.